about all the good initiatives happening at Westchester University at the 3 tents here on the quad. If you're walking by and haven't stopped at one of the tents yet, please do so. There's great food, there's great information, there's great people. You'll be glad you spent a few minutes on the way to your next class. Now, however, I'd like to welcome everyone who is here to this, the beginning of the second half of the Fall 2024 Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. My name is Brad Flam. I hope those of you on Zoom can see us. I am the director of the Office of Sustainability, and we are very proud to co-sponsor the Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar with our colleagues in the Office for Research and Sponsored Programs, as well as the Sustainability Council's Scholarly and Creative Activities Committee. We are thrilled to be welcoming today poet Ramya Ramana in conversation with two of our colleagues from the English department, Professor Cherise Pollard and Professor Cheryl Wanko. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone to Cheryl to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening in. If you want to come over and sit down and hear a little bit more and interact with us a bit more, we're going to have a Q&A at the end of this presentation or this conversation. We thought we would start by having our distinguished guest, Ramya Ramana, read a couple of her poems so that you can get a sense of where she's coming from in terms of sustainability, but also as an artist. So Ramya, welcome to Westchester. I'm sure that other people have welcomed you, but let's do it again. And we're really looking forward to this conversation and your poetry.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'll read a few of my poems. Some of you may have heard them yesterday, but I'll read them again today. The first one is called Listen, and I wrote it really as an act of learning how to listen not only to the people around you, but to nature and to other living things, and being able to pick up on what the world beyond us is saying. And so it's called Listen. Listen, on a winter day when soil is unearthed, a delicacy for the season, the delay of ice cools the grass, gives us mush as landscape. I see my niece playing in mush, which at once years ago was to us snow. We don't expect this gift of water until April, and yet surprise knocks on our faint doors again. Listen, don't put your lips on the fountain we hear in school as kids, as we line up coated with the sweat of outside and avoiding the temptation of touch with a sliver of metal bursting forth. We imagine all touch is this risky, potent, red button dangerous. Listen, who told us the act of convincing must always be loud? Who told us it couldn't be the fire running through a forest or the hot, cold, cold, hot of the Northeast winter, or the human voice fabricated, no longer in touch with its own cells? Listen. All of life has a voice, the grass dulling, overgrown on our suburban backyard, the rats thickening, fang-like, lavishing through the Earl Grey rusted trains, the farmer's hands sore and calloused, the fisherman's hands sore and calloused, the cancellation of a human to the idolization of the other, the birds symphonizing, alerting the antler of the up-and-coming lion, hurricanes in the south, fires in the west, the mutation of human voice, the water marooned, fat in the pool of a child's sink, the girl restricted from herself, the strange noises from Appalachia to the Middle East, to India, informing us either of our territory or warning us of ourselves. Listen, the essence of a thing is when it's not disrupted, not bought by temptation or enlargement or a facade of truth or the mimic of life, but preserved, stewarded, mothered. Listen, oh sweet earth, you are saying a million things all at once, and I am crowded out by the machine of advancement. The second poem is The Sea So Bright, a Coral Reef Sings. And I was watching a documentary, Great Barrier Reef actually, and they were mentioning how since 1995, I think half the coral reefs that were existing there are no longer alive. But I was also reading this other article about the sound and the music of coral reefs. And actually, they were able to find a way to kind of, I don't know, transpose them. And they were creating these really like beautiful kind of uppity, like upbeat, like vibrant sounds. And then there were areas where some of them were not alive or decaying, and the sounds were more ominous and melancholy and down. And so I just started to think about this kind of world where the coral reefs are alive, and what would it be like to visit that place with family, and how you would be able to actually see one another. So anyways, this place is called The Sea So Bright, a Coral Reef Sings, after Thomas Lux. The sea so bright, a coral reef sings a hymn on its base without clicking the metronome monitor. You know you're in the ocean, the school of fish, the wet blazing off the pebbles and shells. You could swim out with your mother into the sea towards the vast depths and still see her. You could swim apart from her and still see her. It's so cerulean and infantized, you need not talk nor fear that particularly burning abrasion gotten by swimming into a shark. You find a lucidity in the colorfulness. Your mother is here, 3 or 4 coral reef families away. You recognize her profile and you don't think she is anyone else. Here with you, 100 or so yards from a segment of the ocean where, in an hour or so, sorry, I messed up the lineage a bit. I'm sorry, I got the wrong page, but we're an hour or so, and then I talk about this octopus and having a fat stick of sea slugs after his shift, where you can hear the coral reefs and their sounds, and that is the sound that's dancing in your ears. This last poem I have is, I was looking up this story in Bolivia where this mother and son lived together, and this mother would walk 3 miles a day to access clean water from the nearest well until they opened up a new source of water that was much closer to her. But I started to think about, in those hours where she was walking and returning in her absence, what her son is picking up, not really being able to intellectually process what's going on at such a young age, but somehow picking up another thing. So the mother's name is Isadora and the son's name is Abel. So it's called Isadora and Abel. In Bolivia, a caramel brown maple baked mother walks miles a day while the son is fueled with its labor. She brings water from the only well in town. The water is to drink, to cook, to bathe. Sweat hisses from her hips, but she does not wilt. No, she says, and denies her feet of its blisters, and wages through the dance of heat dust waltzing around her. Desire is dangerous to a heart muddied with disappointments. At home, her baby boy does not notice the lack of water. He does not notice the jar's short stature or the miniature clay plate set before him. He did not notice the leftover soap hugging his body. He only sees her hands as she wicks the cream votive candle on the windowsill. He watches the steady of her eyes bathing each dirty dish down. He cools his sight on his mother's caramel skin as she irons the beans over the stove. He wonders of her legs, the thick paste of dust wrapping around it. He takes a glass of water and heaven sprinkles in his mouth. He hugs his mom, embracing his arms around her waist. In his faint awakening, he feels a slight tiredness. He wonders if it's hers or his, and if it's hers, he wonders if it must be his too.
Wonderful reading. Thank you so very much for sharing your work with us to start us off this afternoon. We're going to start with a series of questions. The first of which is, what does sustainability mean to you?
Yeah, I think I had a few conversations about this and shared a bit about this yesterday, but when I think about sustainability and just the imagination of what we're building towards, I think about really what we're made for. And I'm reminded of these words like on earth as it is in heaven. And I think that there's a landscape where, we imagine, okay, well, what is heaven? This place where there's no pain, this place where everything can exist in its fullness. And what does that look like to build towards that on earth, knowing that that's actually what we're made for? And so when I think about sustainability, I think about, kind of building from that, but also while we're there, continuing the legacy of people who've come and done the work for us, whether it be storytellers and poets or people that are, in sustainability and are doing the hands-on work of it, or educators, to continue in that legacy, but also to imagine a world where there is no limitation, and to build towards that, knowing that that's actually where we're from and what we're made for. And so that's kind of my framework for sustainability.
Let me do this one.
Well, you're speaking about where, where people come from to get to sustainability. And so we were wondering a little bit about your own personal journey to sustainability. If you could tell us a little bit about that, and maybe, talk a little bit about your sources of inspiration, what inspires you to combine poetry and sustainability.
Yeah, I think for me, my original relationship to poetry began, it was so much more cathartic, and it was private, because for me the page was kind of the safest place to be dangerous. And growing up, moving to Long Island like shortly after 9/11, and being kind of the only brown family in the neighborhood, there was so much I was processing internally but couldn't say out loud. And so for me, that was kind of the inception of why I began. But also in terms of justice, I feel like, when we're informed of justice, it's usually where our first experience of injustice begins. And I think for me, I come from a family. So my family comes from a village in India, and in the village, it was, women were often seen and not heard. And when women were seen, they were seen in acts of service, and so my grandmother, so in Hindu tradition, in like the villages in India, once you get, your menstrual cycle, there is a ceremony that they do. And what that ceremony establishes is that you go from girlhood to a sense of womanhood, that you're ready to produce. And so for my grandmother, there's a thing called a purda, which happens in Hindu families, but also some Muslim families do this too, where after the purda, so my grandmother, at the age of 13, you stay inside the house until you're ready to be married. And so my grandmother was married at 23, which was late for where we come from. So when she was from ages of 13 to 23, she was inside the home, and she couldn't leave from outside of 10 feet of the house, which for me is quite unimaginable, because I grew up here and it's not the life that I've had to live. But even if like actual practically, I haven't had to live that life, those kind of mentalities are sometimes passed down even through the generations. So I think for me, sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but my inception to poetry really began as like a way to discover my voice, and actually actualize my voice. And so I can't imagine my relationship to poetry without thinking about the world beyond me, because that's really the only way that I began it, and it's the only way that I continue it. I mean, now that I've been in the world of poetry more, you can expand a bit, right? And think about other things, but that was really the beginning. And then I was sharing yesterday, it's like, I think there's two ways of justice. There's the protective justice and restorative justice. And when you're young, you think about the protective justice, and I was kind of the black sheep of the family, and which also meant I said things that I wasn't allowed to say, and I probably said things that I shouldn't have said, right? Looking back, I also see the other side. I'm like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said some of those things, but youth, totally. But now that, that fire gets tested and you experience failure and disappointment, you think about what, your perception of justice, think about what endures. And when I consider that, I think it has to be more restorative, and it has to have compassion, even in the realms of pain. And so that's been kind of my entrance towards, in terms of sustainability and justice. And then after that, I think, faith plays a huge part in terms of my relationship to language. And then that is actually what kind of opened the door to my relationship to nature, because I feel like there's so many other ways to communicate outside of language. And in some ways, as a writer, you're always wrestling with the insignificance of language, because there's a place that language can't go. And there's a place where you realize, part of being a writer is not writing, but being a scribe. And so, when you enter into nature, you can kind of enter into that language. But it took a while to get there. I had to fight a lot before, being able to talk about other things outside of my pain. So
this is a question that sort of just comes from what you last said, but may not just be on the script. And I'm thinking about, we were talking yesterday about listening, right? And how important listening is. And listening in relation to faith, listening in relation to nature, and being a scribe, in relation to your writing or your practice. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your practice? Like how do you enter into that dynamic of listening and scribing, transcribing?
yeah, it's a great question. I think I've talked to many number of creatives that have very different processes. And one of my best friends, she's a creative as well, but she's quite an ideator. And so for her, it's thinking about several different ideas and trying to figure which one aligns the best, figure which one to kind of, steward or tackle. And for me, it's quite the opposite. I think I kind of need to empty myself of every other noise. And sometimes that means getting away from people and just being in nature, because there is a stillness that it offers. Sometimes it means sitting with the silence and actually allowing for whatever to speak. But, there's different ways of hearing. I mean, sometimes I get an image in my mind. Callie and I were having this conversation yesterday, but sometimes you get an image in your mind, or sometimes there's just a knowing that you have kind of in your belly, and you begin there. But for me, it is really emptying out all of that external noise and unpacking yourself. And when you're in conversation with people, it can be beautiful, but there's also a lot of different ideas and thoughts that are in place. And you have to discern, what is yours and what is others. And that takes a lot of silence, I think, and not being afraid of that silence. And it's, you can't always wait for the silence, right? Because, I live in a home, and I love it, and I live in a home of 10 people, and it's my whole family. And so there's never physical quietness, right? And so you can't really sometimes wait on that, especially being in New York as well, but you have to figure out a way to cultivate that. And sometimes, for me, I know Ocean Vuong, who's also a writer, when he wrote his novel, he said, he actually went into his closet and he had three really loud roommates, and he went into his closet and wrote his novel. And so, you have to figure out a way to cultivate that silence, I think. And sometimes music can help. There are specific songs that I think can cultivate that. But to your point, it really is emptying out every other noise and listening to what is being said outside of people, places, and atmospheres.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. I'll hand the mic
Oh,
over to
sorry.
Cheryl, but I just wanted to say, it just reminds me of Virginia Woolf talking about a room of her own, that every woman writer needs a room of her own with a key and a lock, and time, right? That becomes the important piece. Like, you can't even hear the message that you need to deliver if you don't have that basic space. That is something also about sustainability space, right? Yeah. Thank you for your answer.
So if we could turn from the more introspective inner life of the poet to how you interface with the external world. For example, right, your social environmental causes, or the way that your poetry intersects with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think the other side of a lot of what I do is, my first time speaking in public in that capacity was at the mayor's inauguration of New York City, at de Blasio's first inauguration. And I think that experience is really interesting because you're not only thinking about your internal reality, but you're thinking about being a voice for others. And I think there's a responsibility that comes with that. I think it's John O'Donohue that says, with privilege, privilege requires the utmost integrity. And I find myself, especially when I'm doing events with the United Nations, sometimes there's high level events with, prime ministers or heads of state. And so there's a different level of responsibility you're tasked with. And in those moments, I think about, well, whose voice is the least amplified in this space? And how can I bring their voice into the space without co-opting another narrative that's not mine, right? Because I can't speak for everyone's experiences, and I don't think it's fair for me to do so. But how do I amplify that voice? And how do I amplify the needs in this space? And how do I say it in a way, because it's very different, I've been in so many different environments as a poet, you get to kind of be like, I've been in the open mics in the Bronx and Brooklyn, which are super fun. And then I've been in poetry readings at, different spaces. But then when you're in spaces that are more political, you are thinking about the audience, but you're also thinking about the people in power and how to speak courage into them. Because on one end, you have to hold them accountable, but on another end, they're in incredibly difficult positions of decision making, and there are many noises out there to buy their decisions. And so you're thinking about how to speak courage into them to make the right decisions. And so that's kind of my relationship when I'm speaking at the United Nations or when I'm speaking at more highly politicized events. And I think a lot of the work that I do, so far, I think the work that I've mostly done, I've worked with Plan International and really talking about girls' education, especially in marginalized communities, especially with the background that I come from. That's really important to me. I've worked in various schools in New York City too. And so that to me is an important matter to bring into these places. Like, how do we fund girls' education? How do we amplify the voice of young girls, particularly young women of color, and even non-English speaking girls that are in the US, right? That language matters too, and that voice matters in this space too. So I think for me in that interface, it's much more about the responsibility and not wasting it away and not utilizing it for my own gain, And so, yeah, that's how I show up in those spaces. It requires And it's quite costly in that way, right? And so, yeah.
Well, and I'm reminded too, because of some of your poetry, of the ways that you're trying to give voice to the people and things around us that have no voice, right? Nature, coral reefs, that idea that we need to listen, and trying to do that in human language, right? Kind of pointing to that tension in art and in poetry.
Thank you. Great answers and really provocative questions. I want to focus on something that you just were talking about in terms of the mentorship of young girls and women, and not just giving them a voice, but also helping them come into their own voices, right? Or championing education, particularly if you're going back to your village where your family comes from, or even in New York, right? Even in the city or out on the island. What are some of the things that you do to help young girls and women feel more empowered as writers or as members of communities?
It's a great question. It's interesting when I work in schools specifically, I realize poetry is a vehicle, really, because I'm not trying to get them to write like these insanely like brilliant academic poets. So they naturally do, right? But I'm trying to get them to actualize their own voice. And I think number one, I remember there was this singer, his name is Jason Upton, and one of the things he said is, when he went to his son's room at night, and he said, "I love you," and it was the most awkward thing because his son was becoming a teenager. But he said, then another time he just put his arms around him, and that alone was enough. And I think there is something about presence when you're in the room with young girls and actually allowing them to speak. Because I find that, to be honest, when I'm in a lot of schools in New York City, particularly in the Bronx or in Brooklyn, a lot of the times, what happens unintentionally is because teachers are overwhelmed and they're not as supported. And so a lot of that gets, a lot of the people that experience the worst of that is the students. And so students' names, like, you hear your name associated with correction enough and you start to identify with being bad. And I notice that happens a lot. And so for me is really trying to like not associate like that their identity is not just about being corrected, but actually being heard. And so you actually have to give them space to be imperfect at times. And that can be, you have to glorify in the mess a little bit, especially when working with young girls who are figuring it out and are in kind of underprivileged communities where sometimes there is violence and sometimes they are doing things they're not supposed to be doing, especially in school property, So how do you hold space for them, but still be a voice? And then I think when it comes to poetry, I mean, representation is really wonderful in that sense. I try to introduce them to people and show them to people that actually allow them to imagine themselves in the world beyond their physical location. And so that's a bit of the way. And then, of course, like, I think even with my niece and helping raise my niece, one of the things that, I do is we talked about a bit of this yesterday, but this kind of self-affirmative talk, right? And beginning that language early, because I think so much of the language that's out there does not partner with that. And so, if you can already start to kind of change their interior world or define their interior landscape before the world does, I think you've gotten ahead. And so that's a lot of what I do. I mean, when I work with middle school young girls, unfortunately, they've already experienced so much trauma a lot of the work is healing through poetry. A lot of the work of writing is cathartic. And so it is more healing and trying to be restorative versus trying to build a clean interior landscape from the beginning. But that work will continue. Yeah. Yeah.
I know it's a little warm out here, so if you need to take a beverage break. There's you have so many beverages. So I wonder if we could turn now to the idea of your audience, like who you are imagining when you're writing poetry. And do you think that poetry, in relation to sustainability or other issues, do you think that it does work in the world for young people in your audience?
I think my audience has changed throughout the years in terms of who I believe I'm talking to. When I was young, when I was Youth Poet Laureate, so much of the space that you're in is being a youth ambassador and being a voice for young people, which in itself, it's an interesting position to be in, because how can you really be a voice for all young people? I mean, there's so many of us out there with all different stories. But I think as I've kind of grown older, and I hope this isn't too lofty or like weird to say, but I think like my audience is like, rather than people, it's truth. Like, am I being integrous to truth right now? Am I saying what actually needs to be said? And so when I think of audience, I think almost of who's holding you accountable. And for me, if I think too much of audience, then I'm always going to be trying to please what people desire to hear. And for me, I think it's more important to be committed to truth, than to that, because people will always want to change. People will always change what they want to hear from you. And so I'm trying to kind of move away from that. But to your point about, does poetry work? And it's such an interesting question, right? It's such a big question, because in some ways, yes, right? Because poetry has changed me, but then also, who am I to say I'm a poet? So of course it's worked for me, but it may not work for everybody. And I think that's the kind of, when we think about change, when we think about sustainability, so much of the Western culture is and this can be kind of like a hyper capitalist way of looking at things, is that we idolize the hero. And I think we all want to be the heroes of this world. And the reality is that we all play a part. And so poets play a part, but so do teachers, and so do business folks. And so we all have an equal contribution. So yes, does poetry make a change? Yeah, but I think it equally makes a change just as much as anybody in the field committed to sustainability, committed to justice. And we are all a body. Like we all, some people are the arms, some people are the legs, some people are the head, and that's okay. But I no longer, when I was young, I think I was definitely played into that. And I didn't even always realize I was doing it, but you kind of want to be the hero, and as I grow older, I'm less interested in that. And I realize that in itself is not very sustainable, right? Like, how long are you going to do that before you burn out? And so
We can't keep looking for heroes.
yes, yes, totally. And so, and I was talking to one of the students yesterday, but everybody talks about the revolution, but what happens on day 2? It's like, how do we steward that? How do we keep that? And that takes an ecosystem of people to really participate in. So yes, poetry contributes, but everybody contributes, and that we all play our part, and we all must be present with what we've been tasked with.
Yeah.
Thank you. And this really is about responsibility, right? And the sort of the body of the community or the nation, and what roles we play in that part. And I was thinking about our conversation yesterday about genre. We sort of touched on it, and how you were thinking about, am I going to write poetry for this book, or am I going to write creative nonfiction or fiction? And you read a story about a short story about your father and pomegranates and going to Costco or BJ's. They're like a big warehouse store. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about genre. Are there particular genres that work better for getting the word out? Right. There are people who are poetry phobic, or people who are poetry more fiction adjacent or whatever. I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that, what that question becomes for you.
Yeah. Such a good question. I think poetry is unique in a way, especially spoken word. That's the background I kind of originate from. And so much of spoken word is about social justice. Our much of the narratives in spoken word is about social justice. And I think it works because it's ancient, right? It's that kind of ancient tradition of storytelling that we all gather and we all respond to. And it is an ancient form of art. It wasn't always called spoken word, right? Yeah, but it was just poetry aloud. And so I think there is something really, because of its ancient origins, it still resonates to this day, although it's adapted different cadences and different aesthetic exteriors. But it still holds that weight. So I will always, even though I don't slam anymore and I'm not part of that world, but I will always kind of amplify its roots. And even hip hop is really brilliant in that way because I think because of its origins, because of where it comes from, it can never veer too far from that, even if it tries. So I will say, in terms of implementing the world, in the world, that kind of performative poetry, it has a huge impact. And then in terms of poetry on a page, we have a unique privilege as poets to use the expanse of a page that I think other writers don't have. So, we can use white space, we can use enjambments, we can use line breaks. And, we were talking about rhyme yesterday, right? And, Eastern and Western rhyme are different, right? Because Eastern rhyme happens in thought. So like Hebraic rhyme, for example, is you say a line and then the next line, like they rhyme in couplets. And so you say a line and the next rhyme either contradicts it or it deepens it. And so they rhyme based in thought and not sonically, versus we rhyme sonically. And so that presents a unique opportunity, I think, like to share revelation, especially couplets. Like I've specifically been drawn to couplets because I think because they're so small, I think small containers of language actually create tension, and therefore, and tension creates revelation, right? In life too. Right, totally. And so I think that couplets in terms of poetry form is really interesting in producing revelation. Prose is really interesting in that way. And I think poetry and nonfiction have a lot in common, especially now because the personal narrative is so important and the dramatic monologue is so important and it's so desired right now. So I will say, yeah, those two seem to, for this hour, for this era, seem to really work. Every era is different, so that will change. But I think for now, the poetry and nonfiction are doing really interesting things in the world. And of course, science fiction as well, which I haven't gotten too into, but hopefully one day I will. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, as a person who grew up in 18th century British literature, the couplet is the form ne plus ultra. So I love to hear about the couplets, but I think it's time now to turn to the audience because we're at that speaker moved. And so, yeah, we're talking into the speaker. Thank you. Yeah, it shifts with the wind. So, does anyone in the audience have a question? You can bring the microphone to you so you don't have to shout over the wind. And maybe, Brad.
Well, I was going to help you with the microphone in the audience,
I appreciate it.
but I can jump in with a quick comment at least. I've been listening to this conversation and it reminds me that in my job, I spend so much time thinking about carbon emissions and anaerobic biodigesters and energy efficiency. And it's just so energizing to hear words of compassion and love and trauma coming into these conversations around sustainability. So I just wanted to thank the three of you for leading this conversation today. and expanding my vocabulary and thinking about sustainability. Any other questions? Yes.
You say is like your biggest influence from the Western world and from the Eastern?
So good. We Thank you so much. It's such a good question. I mean, I think in the Western world, there's a few. Sorry, is this good? Okay. I mean, I love Mary Oliver, who Renee Blacksmith read a few of her poems this morning at their Gordon Reserves, and that was wonderful. Patricia Smith, who's a contemporary poet, is brilliant. I think she kind of informed me a lot about language. And then in terms of, I mean, there's many more. Even in Western, I think Wendell Berry is a brilliant poet. I think, in terms of more contemporary poets, Aja Monet, I particularly like her sound. And I love, I mean, this may be cheesy or classic, but I love Pablo Neruda. I think he's a brilliant poet. And then in terms of Eastern poets, I mean, honestly, I love the Persian poets. I love Rumi, I love Hafez. He's Lebanese, but Khalil Gibran, I think, is a brilliant poet. But really, these kind of they were the Sufi mystics, right? And I think I love, even Mary Oliver kind of follows into that. I mean, she wouldn't probably consider herself a Sufi mystic, but she is mystical in nature. And they are nature poets as well. And so, yeah, I would say that. And then even in the Eastern poets, and when you think about Rumi and Hafez, they talk a lot about nature and love and faith, but they actually did it in a time where it was quite radical to do so, and it was quite costly. And their lives were under threat because they were talking about the things that they were talking about, so huge inspirations. Yeah.
First off, thank you for this conversation. It's very interesting to listen to. One of my questions is, what was one of the most surprising or interesting learning experiences that you had interacting with dignitaries or officials from the United Nations and or folks that are higher up? And any surprises, any challenges, and how did you navigate them? So good.
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's a lot of surprises. There's a lot of challenges. I think I think I was having this conversation, actually, I think with Brad and Hallie, briefly talked about it yesterday, but when you do speak at high level events, there is a lot. I mean, number one, you have to submit the script, right? Which makes sense because they have to approve everything you say. But in the midst of that, there can often be a lot of edits made or suggested. And in that, there's always a discernment between what's a considerate edit and what is censorship. And so I think for me, that's something that I've had to navigate as, what is my boundary in terms of like, what am I willing to not say and say? And then, when do you pull your voice and say, I'm actually not comfortable speaking in this place if you're going to prohibit me from saying certain things. I think there was a high level event and which there was a lot of press, and I won't name the event, but because there was so much press around it, they went through all of my social media and every single, I think they went through every single person I interacted with because they just didn't want any backlash. And so I think that was a really interesting experience to be monitored that heavily. And then in terms of, that's kind of the more challenging side of things. It's not, my life's not under threat. There are certain people in certain nations whose lives are under threat. And so in that way, I'm much more privileged. And I'm not as courageous as some people who have to go back to certain nations and then actually face serious consequences than I have to. but it is a unique challenge, and you do have to kind of discern, you know, what am I willing to say and what am I, like, at what point do I pull my voice, you know? But in the midst of that, I think, you know, what kind of sustains me in these places is that you do meet a lot of high level politicians who are actually committed to the work. And that's always a gift to see. I mean, with the UN, they're more so international. So I don't really interact with too many US politicians, or even local politicians. A lot of them are dignitaries from abroad. But you know, I met last year, she was and I think it's okay for me to say this, but she was the Prime Minister of St. Martin, and she actually began as a teacher. And now she's not being reelected, but she was the Prime Minister, and she was so committed to girls' education. And I think after my poem, we were able to, you know, we had a brief encounter, but she actually went back and she, you know, implemented quite a few changes and into her own policies. And so that's kind of what you're looking for ultimately, is the fruit, right? That's how you measure it. Like, do you go back and do they actually implement these policies that they speak? So, you know, there's a lot of eloquent speech, right? And there's a lot of I mean, they may not be poets, but they're so poetic, you know, and so you can easily be bought, you know, you can easily be swept, but that's not the measure of change. That's not the measure of impact. The measure is, okay, are you going back and actually doing things? And so you do meet people along the way that really are. And that to me is, I mean, it brightens your own heart, because I think I began as just not trusting any government official, and I've actually, not that I have a whole lot of trust, but I've learned, my heart has expanded a little bit in those areas. And to actually, you know, as I was saying earlier, to actually speak courage into them. And there is something about, like, you know, yes, they are these incredibly powerful people that make these really important decisions that affect people and hurt people. And then there's also politicians you meet that they're actually just human beings who need people to support and to encourage them. And so I think that has expanded my capacity. My 19-year-old self would be so disappointed in what I just said. I'd be like, what do you mean? You know, what do you mean you don't want to overthrow everything? You know, right? I'd be like, you sell out, you know. But you know, as I mature from, like, you know, from that protective justice to that restorative justice, you know, I think about, okay, how can I contribute in a way that's fruitful and not just me being mad at the world forever, you know? So, yeah, but great question. Yeah.
All right, so it looks like we are at the closing time of our discussion today. So do you have any final words, Dr. Pollard?
I just want to speak a word of gratitude. Thank you, Ramya, for being so open with us, and for speaking a word of encouragement for us and courage, and helping us to imagine that we can have sustainable practices that are also multivalent and not just multicultural, but they have multi-levels to them. And so really appreciate that. And thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for being so present and wonderful.
And thank you. And thank you all for coming. Had to get away.
I have no closing words,
Okay.
other than gratitude to the three of you, to those of you who have joined us, and those of you who have joined us on Zoom. All right. The Sustainability Showcase is going on for another hour. So please, if you haven't visited every table, gotten some delicious food, met some interesting people, please spend some of the next hour expanding your horizons here at Westchester University.
And the
Thank you so
therapy
much.
dog
It's
is
so
so
wonderful.
It's a dog to pet.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the dog wants to pay for it.
Wise. So wise.
Thank you. I was just, it's no one